Open the podcast bay doors, Hal.
Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 109 of Welcome to Geektown. I'm your host, Kurt Onstead. I've been a proud geek all my life, being into role-playing games, board games, sci-fi, fantasy, and especially superheroes and comics. And I want to help others join me in those pursuits, but I found that sometimes people can get overwhelmed or feel left out because they don't already have what some consider the requisite knowledge to be considered a fan. And that's where Welcome to Geektown comes in. Here you can ask your questions without feeling like a gatekeeper is calling you out for not yet being fully versed in every aspect of your new interest. This week, I thought I'd go back to discussing one of my favorite non-comic book topics, board games. There are literally thousands of board games out there. The website Board Game Geek lists over 125,000. Although that includes expansions and new additions for previous games. Now, it's impossible to come up with just a few categories to place every single game into, but there are a few terms that have been used over the years to help describe various games and give a basic idea of how they're played. However, if you're unfamiliar with those terms, that's not going to help you decide if a particular game sounds like fun to you. So, this episode, I'm going to introduce some of the most common game mechanics, using a few popular games as examples. As a reminder, I went into more details on legacy games and dungeon crawlers back in episodes 5 and 32 respectively. So if you want to know more about those kinds of games in particular, which happen to be two of my favorite types, be sure to go back and take a listen. So, let's start with who is playing and against who. There are some solo games out there, all the variations of solitaire played with a standard card deck, for instance, but the great majority of games are played with multiple players. If you need more than 5 or so players, that's usually referred to as a party game, like Apples to Apples, or the more raunchy version of basically the same game, Cards Against Humanity. But I'll mostly be focusing on the 2 to 5 player games that most people think of when they hear the phrase board games. Within these games, there are 3 basic categories for who you are playing against. Each player for themselves, co-op, or one versus many. Most of the well-known American games played by kids, like Candyland, The Game of Life, and Monopoly, are each player for themselves. There's one person who wins, and everyone is trying to be that one winner. Then there are cooperative games, where each turn the game takes certain actions that make winning more difficult, and all the players are working together to beat the game. Pandemic is probably the most popular game of this nature, where players are all acting as various scientists and doctors trying to keep the world from being overrun with different diseases. If you prefer something a little less real, most of the games in the Cthulhu mythos made by Fantasy Flight, including Arkham Horror, Eldritch Horror, and Elder Sign, are also cooperative games. Finally, there's one versus many. In these games, all of the players are on one team except for a single player who is controlling the other side. One of my favorites in this vein is Fury of Dracula, where one character plays as Dracula, secretly moving around the board, while the other players are different vampire hunters trying to track down where Dracula is to defeat him. With this kind of game, it's very important that the person who is the one, as opposed to part of the many, wants to be in that position, so keep that in mind when choosing your roles to ensure everyone has a good time. In almost all co-op and one versus many games, and some of the each player for themselves, you'll run into something called variable player powers. Unlike a standard game where everyone can take the same exact actions on their turns as any other player, each character either has a special action they can take or is better at a type of action somehow. For instance, in Pandemic, one character is able to automatically keep diseases from appearing in their space or any of the spaces next to them, while another is able to remove all the disease cubes of a color from one space in a single action, rather than one cube per action as per the normal rules. This helps add more replayability to the game, as you can try out different roles each time and different combinations to add more variety. Now that you know who you're playing against and or with, the next question is, how do you win? This breaks down into two basic categories: victory points or victory condition. Victory points is easy enough to explain. As you play the game, various actions earn you points. In games where money is the main path to victory, you can think of those as a kind of point. Your goal is to have the most points at the end of the game. In the majority of modern games, you have a limited number of rounds, at which point the game ends automatically and points are counted up. Often there are bonus points that specifically get counted at the end of the game, so the winner isn't immediately obvious. Other games have a certain point total you're trying to reach, and the first one to surpass that threshold is the winner. Or passing that total starts the final round, giving everyone one last chance to surpass the first person. Victory conditions, on the other hand, don't use points, but use some state of the game to determine the winner. Or in co-op games, whether the players as a group win or lose. Going back to Pandemic, when all 4, or 5 depending on the version of the game, of the diseases have been cured, the players win. There are multiple ways the game can defeat the players, mostly involving running out of resources available at the start of the game. Conditions like this can also be used as a flag for ending the game, then points are counted. Terraforming Mars is an example of this. There are 3 tracks used to measure the oxygen level, temperature, and amount of liquid water on the planet. Once those 3 tracks have hit their maximum, that signals the final round. Alright, we have terms for who's playing and how to win. Now let's get into the meat of the game itself, also known as the game mechanics. Probably the most common mechanic is some sort of resource management, where you collect some basic items and use them to trade or build into more complex items, which earn you points or otherwise help you towards winning the game. Let's use Catan as our example, as it is one of the most consistently best-selling games of the past few years. In this game, you're collecting various resources. The game actually refers to them as wool, lumber, brick, grain, and ore, but because of the images used to represent them, you'll often hear them referred to as sheep, wood, stone, wheat, and gold, respectively. You'll collect these resources in various ways and can use them to build roads, settlements, and cities, which help you both collect more resources for future turns, as well as earning you points in and of themselves. Resource management games are often related to a mechanic you'll hear referred to as engine building. Catan is a very mild version of this, but other games like Race for the Galaxy and Terraforming Mars take this to the next step, where the first few resources you receive are fairly small, but as you purchase new items and powers with your starting resources, those allow you to get more or better resources, and this builds upon itself as you continue to upgrade, so that by the middle or near the end of the game, if you've played well, you'll have a combination that is providing you with huge amounts of resources that earn you points or move you quickly towards the victory condition. Like I said, resource management is the most common game mechanic, but how you collect resources varies greatly from game to game. For Catan, it mostly depends on the roll of the dice, combined with the location of your pieces on the map. There's a lot of luck involved in that, although strategy is also part of the game, or there wouldn't be the same few players showing up at the top of Catan tournament standings. If you want to remove some of the luck component and make it even more strategy-based, you'll probably want to find a worker placement game. The D&D themed game Lords of Waterdeep is a typical example here. You start each game with 4 workers, and get a 5th halfway through the game. On your turn, you place 1 worker in one of the various buildings on the board. Each building gives you some specific resources to collect. In this case, the different colored cubes represent the 4 basic D&D classes: Fighter, Rogue, Wizard, and Cleric. And there are also coins for money. And you use these resources to complete quests, which earn you points and/or more resources. However, each building only has space for 1 worker, so once a space has been chosen, no one else can go to that location to collect those resources until the end of the round, when all the players take back their workers and a new round begins. So, choosing which locations to go to, and in what order in a particular round, is an important part of the game. One of my personal favorites for introducing worker placement mechanics is Stone Age. In this variation of worker placement, there are multiple slots for workers, and how many workers you send changes how many resources you can receive. It's still somewhat luck-based, as you roll a die for each worker sent, and the total rolled determines how many resources you get. In this game, you're a little less likely to get completely blocked from spaces that are helpful to you, which I think makes it a more beginner-friendly option. But what if resource management isn't what you're looking for? Well, then perhaps you're looking for an area control game. One of the oldest known games still actively played, Go, is an area control game. Perhaps the most famous area control board games created in the last century is Risk, with pieces representing the size of armies, which you use to attack and defend sections of the map in order to take over the world. Most games that are themed around war involve at least some area control mechanic. That includes Small World, Twilight Imperium, and Scythe, to name a few popular examples in my circle. Terraforming Mars, mentioned earlier, has an area control element to it, even though I would classify it primarily as a resource management game. Which brings up a point. Most games, especially more complex ones, will combine multiple mechanics to create its own experience. Even if I describe a game as primarily belonging in one group, it probably has other aspects to it, either in its original form or added by a later expansion, that are one of the ways games can differentiate from each other. Theming being the other major difference, like how Legendary Encounters Alien and Marvel Legendary feel like different games despite having nearly the same mechanics. The other major mechanic I want to bring up this episode is set collection. It's pretty self-explanatory, but has enough variation in it that it can be used for many different games. For instance, Pandemic, the co-op mentioned much earlier, is a set collection game. In order to cure a disease, you need 5 cards of the same color. Each player draws 2 cards a turn, and can potentially trade with other players, depending on their role and their location on the map. Once you have a matching set, you can trade those in at any space with a research station to cure the disease of the matching color. Another set collection game I've been playing quite a bit is Azul, which is a very simple but entertaining game where you are trying to fill in various sized rows with matching tiles in order to earn points. One game is co-op, one game is each player for themselves. One has variable player powers, the other doesn't. They're about as different as two games can be, but both can be classified in the set matching category as their main mechanic. I've touched on a few of the major mechanics that you'll see most commonly in modern board games, but while there's a large swath of games covered by what I've talked about so far, there's tons of other mechanics and features I haven't discussed yet. Perhaps you have a term that you've heard people use in discussing their favorite game that you're unfamiliar with. If that's the case, please feel free to ask me, and I can cover it in a future episode. You can send your questions and or comments via email to welcometogeektown, all spelled out, @gmail.com. Or you can go to the website, welcome to, the number 2 in this case, geektown.com, and click the Submit a Question link if you'd prefer to remain anonymous. Other contact options include facebook.com/welcometogeektown or Twitter @geektownpodcast. Also, if you'd like to support the show directly, come join the Patreon at patreon.com/welcometogeektown for just $1 per month to get access to full scripts of the shows, outtakes, and a monthly shoutout. You can also help the show grow by subscribing and giving a 5-star review over on Apple Podcasts to join the Geektown City Council, which helps other people find the show, so we can all tell them, welcome to Geektown, population, us. Welcome to Geektown is written, narrated, edited, and produced by me, Kurt Onstead. Theme music is by Aaron Levitz, logo art by Archie Santana. All other sound clips are the copyrighted material of their respective owners, and no infringement is intended, falling under fair use.